They added to it what they liked and erased from it what they hated, and they erased the name of Muhammad, peace be upon him, from the Torah, and for that Allah became angry.
And I mean, even in early Christian tradition, within church tradition, there was methodologies to decipher what books are canonical and which books aren't.
The majority went on inferred meanings of the text.
It'd be based on my story versus your story, as far if you're looking at it from a historical lens. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the LT World YouTube channel. Today, we got another great interview with Faroos. Faroos, feel free to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. So I'm the Faroos. It's a pseudonym. It's not actually a real name. I have a channel, Experience Islam with the Faroos, where I, discuss various issues on Islam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Yeah, I came across your channel and what you do, because I watch a lot of different debates and discussions and stuff between Muslims, Christians, people like that. And the video you did with David and AP, I think it was, came up on my screen, and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. And so I watched it, and I thought it would be a great discussion. What you presented was, I think, very fair-handed and would be great for this channel since it's like comparative religion stuff. So that's why I brought you on.
Okay.
So I guess the thing that the presentation will be mainly on is, I think, what's colloquially known as the Quranic dilemma from the Christian apologist standpoint. But it's just basically about how the Quran views the Bible and the different interpretations and stuff throughout different time periods. But let me allow you to screen share here.
Once again, thank you for inviting me. So the title of this is The Muslim Perspectives on the Gospel and Earlier Scriptures Throughout History. So in this presentation, you should understand how the Muslims understand the Quran, periods of Quranic interpretation, how Muslims understood during each period, and the majority and minority interpretations with supporting text and history. Disclaimer, this presentation exclusively focuses on Muslim views on previous scriptures throughout history. This presentation will not focus on proving any religion true or false. If you accept my claims, it doesn't prove or disprove any religion. Likewise, if you reject them. So this is a discussion on interpretation and history. So exegesis, interpretation of the Quran from a classical Muslim perspective. So Muslims who engage in exegesis use the following methods to understand or interpret a Quran verse. So they look at the Quran by the Quran. So if there's a verse on one topic and a verse on that same topic in other places, they put them next to each other. Another is exegesis of Quran by hadith. Hadith literature are collected narrations, statements by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The exegesis of the Quran by narrations of the first three generations of Muslims. So, those that are from those who learn directly from the Prophet Muhammad, those who learn directly from them, and then those who learn directly from them. Exegesis by classical Arabic language, grammar, roots, inverse roots, rhetoric. In a history, you find people like Zamakhshari, Abu Hayyan. In modern days, Begin Institute, Neil Robinson, Raymond Farron, they try to look at the Quran from a classical. I mentioned the Itqan by Jalaluddin As-Suyuti. I've seen a course online on that book now. Exegesis by current trends in history, science, and philosophy, like Al-Razi. Now, an exegete can choose one approach or look at various approaches. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm dividing the exegesis into three periods. The formative, which is roughly 632 to 932, classical 933 to 1700, and modern 1700 to present. Now, there's going to be overlap, so nothing is going to be pure. So during the formative period, there were two interpretations of the position of the Quran on the previous scriptures. One is that the previous scriptures, the Torah, Psalms, and Gospels, were altered and written in oral form. That was majority position. One is that the previous scriptures were altered in oral form, but not written form. That's a minority position. So during the classical period, then the majority of Muslims settled on the majority position. This was partially due to exposure to more sources from Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, Hellenistic tradition. The modern period split into two. So the majority still agree with the classical period, but there's been further discussion on intertextuality. One is right now is Professor Imran al-Badawi. I think he's in Houston. You know, and fun fact, we used to hang out when we were like, 19 years old. And now we live on two different sides of the country, but back then we didn't. Minority interpretation. So that comes from the literal meaning of 289, 291, 2101, 381, 447. There's a lot, those verses tend to mention the Torah and the gospel, but they'll say, the one you have with you, the one you have with you. So the literal meaning is implying the physical book that they have with them at the time. So I put it at the end, but maybe I'll reference it here and one now. And one of the challenges that come into this argument is that there are some verses of the Quran which are seem to be inferring or implying about the books that are with the Jews and Christians at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then there's those that are referring to, that most apparent meaning is that they're referring to a revelation to Jesus alayhi salam in the language of Jesus, and to Musa or Moses alayhi salam in the language of Moses. So an original revelation. So I notice in a lot of discussions, the Christians who argue for the Islamic dilemma bring up the former, and many of the Muslims bring up the latter. But I very rarely see a marrying of the two in the argument. And then like a hadith like this, Amr bin Shahr said, I was with Najis, who was the ruler of Ethiopia, when his son recited a verse of the gospel. So I laughed, and thereupon he said, do you laugh at the word of Allah the Exalted? This is in Abu Dawood. Now I know some people might point out this has other interpretations, and they'd be accurate. I just brought this up as an example. It's one, the argument isn't from one text, it's a summative understanding of the text. And this interpretation was more popular before the Muslims became in contact more and reading and started studying comparative religions more at the time. Did it kind of fade away over time? So the majority interpretation, I'm going to split this interpretation at two: evidence from external sources and evidence from internal sources. So internal evidence, the majority of the Muslim exegete over millennia understand the inferred meaning of 275 to 79 in the Quran is that there were individuals amongst the people of the scripture that altered their text. The majority of Muslims agree with the exegesis of Ibn Abbas that 5:13 to 15 also imply that the previous scriptures were altered. Then we have internal evidence from hadith. So this is a hadith in a collection of Bukhari, and narrated Akrama Ibn Abbas said, how can you ask the people of the scriptures about their books while you have Allah's book, Quran, which is in the most recent of the books revealed by Allah, and you read it in its pure, undistorted form? Another by Uthman ibn Affan, who is the one who the Quran, that we have today goes back to, that, that he was the one who, not the first to collect it, but the first to codify the canon, I guess. It's a little complex, so I'm not going to.
Isn't he the third caliph or something like that?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They added to it what they liked and erased from it what they hated, and they erased the name of Muhammad, peace be upon him, from the Torah, and for that Allah became angry. So this is internal evidence that the majority of Muslims viewed it in text and wording. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam stated, narrate from the people of the book as long as it does not contradict what I brought. Now, internal evidence, this is from the tafsir of Ibn Abbas. Now, when I was on, AP did point out that this is not an authentic tafsir that goes back to Ibn Abbas, and what he said is partially accurate. So like Ibn Abbas did not write this tafsir. someone wrote it later, collecting different statements that Ibn Abbas gave on different verses. And some of them will be authentic and some of them won't be in the text. So the text by itself is not authentically written by him, but it does contain some true and some factually accurate and some factually inaccurate information in it. So it's not like throw away the whole text. You can look at it, but it's, it's like a supporting evidence, not a,
it wouldn't be like the backbone of your argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, inferred meanings, because that are accepted, sometimes some of the companions got meanings from it through their understanding of the language and the expressions that someone from the outside might not get, or even from the inside who wasn't there. So we find in this hadith, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Omar, who was the second caliph of Islam, and Ibn Abbas was a youth at the time, I think like a teenager or something like around that age, or maybe a couple years off. But they were talking about the chapter 110 of the Quran, and the verse says, "When comes the help of Allah against and the conquest," right? And it's talking about the conquest of Mecca. It goes on. So, when Omar asked them, "What does this mean?" A lot of the companions just gave the literal verse, and they're not necessarily wrong, but there was more to it than that. And then Omar asked Ibn Abbas if he says the same, and he said no. And he said, this is referring that it's a sign of the death of Allah's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then he recites up to the third verse that it's telling him you're going to die soon. But it didn't say you're going to die soon. It was just telling him to praise God. Praise.
So you're
God
using this
more
as like evidence that inferred meaning can be taken from the Quran or the Hadith tradition. You don't always have to read things strictly from a literal standpoint.
Yes, and that's accepted. It's not something I made up. Like, here's a text going back over 1,000 years.
That's actually, I mean, I find this is the thing that's always interesting, I think, about textual discussion and historical discussion, is generally speaking, more times than not, this is where the argument falls. Are you going to take it literally, or are you going to take it figuratively, or something in between? Because like you said earlier, a lot of times when you see the discussion between Christians and Muslims on different topics, whether it be the Bible's textual accuracy or the Quran's textual accuracy, when it comes to interpretation, it almost always boils down to one's taking it very literally and one's taking it very figuratively. And then they try to defend why you should take it their way.
And the funny part is sometimes I'm the same one. So like, I'm on the same topic. So, I've had discussions on, the various hadith where some people interpret them to, especially more on the non-Muslim side, to mean that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam believed the earth was going, the day of judgment was going to happen within 100 years.
Yes, I saw that one.
Yeah, and they'll be very literal with that one, but many often what I notice is some opponents on the atheists will point out that many opponents on the Christian side did the same thing with there's verses in the New Testament that say, where Jesus is reported to have said, this generation will not pass until they see the second coming. And so they'll interpret theirs figuratively, but the Muslims literally. And
I mean, people who will have a bias towards their faith, I mean, obviously that is the case. Like, as a Christian, I'm going to have a bias towards the Bible being true, and as a Muslim, you're going to have a bias that the Quran's true. Generally speaking, it's hard to disassociate yourself from the assumption that my book wouldn't contradict itself. So you try then to find plausible meanings and explanations for how these things can work together in harmony. And that's the hard thing sometimes to distinguish, because like I've read through the Quran one time, and I read some commentary on it here and there. And the one thing I found interesting is that like a lot of times people, I mean, it's really popular on YouTube. When I listen to the actual academic discussions, they hardly ever come up, but scientific miracles is one that comes up on YouTube a lot, on the popular media. And what's interesting to me is then you have other videos where it's like the scientific non-miracles of the Quran, and like one example would be like the sun setting in muddy waters, but then someone on the scientific miracles say will point to we made all living things from water, and then you look at the commentary on that, and they say the sun setting in murky water ought to be taken figuratively, but this one's ought to be taken more literally. And again, it's just going back to the fact that it's always interesting how it always goes back to that sort of assumption that my book would not contradict itself, so I'll take things figuratively and literally to fit within that assumption.
I try to offer the same to both books as much as possible. And so you come up with as many possible ways to harmonize them. And then if you can't, you just have to say you can't, or you just,
There comes a
this
point
is a challenge, this is a problematic,
There's a point where you just have to sort of agree to disagree when it comes to these sort of topics.
Yeah.
But yeah, keep going on. I just thought that was interesting.
No, okay. So some of the majority, the external evidence, that supported the majority of position. So like many of the Muslims look at, the compilation of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and how, they removed 1 John 5:7-8 and said this was not part of the original text, and they've taken it out. The story about Jesus not stoning the adulteress, this was not in the original text, and they took it out. Mark chapter 16, 9-20, and different verses they took out and as later interpolations. So, Muslims will look at this and say, well, the wording and speaking argument is more accurate. Also, I think, so this is one of those that I think these next two get a little sticky, and I'll explain why. So the majority of Christian seminaries today, not all, but majority, accept that and teach the historical critical method. Now, the general consensus amongst the historical critical scholars is that no text of the Bible accurately reflect the history. Now, here's where it gets sticky, because people might, when I said that I try to use the same method for both faith, would I list this as an argument, let's say against, or would I list this in what I would say Muslim arguments or Christian arguments, Islamic texts? Not necessarily. And my reasoning, though, is because the reason I bring this up is because a Christian majority accepts it now as valid, whereas we don't have a Muslim majority that would accept the same method as valid. But if that ever happens, I would equally bring it up. The only reason I bring it up is because of the numbers, not the method.
And do you want to give like a general definition or overview of what the historical critical method is for anyone who may not fully understand what that means?
Sure. So the historical critical method is people want to study the text within its historical context. What did the words mean? What was the culture at the time? And then what do the external sources? They don't. A devotional method assumes that it's true, and you try to make all the verses that apparently contradict fit in one method, whereas historical method will state, different authors had a different viewpoint, and those different viewpoints are reflected. So Paul and James Matthew don't have to agree, because Matthew was writing from his perspective, Paul from his, James from his, and they represent different interpretations. Where a devotional method, like you have to either make them fit or state that one canceled out the other. I'm not doing a great job at this explanation, but it's, it's also not coming with the perspective that it's true, coming with the perspective like that it's spiritually true or religious, coming from the perspective that this is something that happened in history.
Yeah.
And what is history? What were common? So it's looking at it from academic lens versus a lens of a religious follower.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note there's a couple of reasons I think for that within the Christian tradition specifically, is because a lot of Christians will defend the death and resurrection of Jesus as a historical thing that literally took place, because it's a counter argument towards Gnosticism and things like that, where it's this idea that Jesus came down in a spiritual form, but he never physically died. because he was too spiritual for that. Actually, he just spiritually ascended and things. And I think the historical critical method played a big part for a lot of historians to try to counteract that argument. And it's also, I think, as you said, not everyone necessarily within the historical critical method will always agree on how accurate the Bible is and things like that. There is always majorities and minorities and disagreements within these scholarly fields. And there are people who try to blend the historical critical method with devotional method. People like Gary Habermas, Sean McDowell, and some other historians and academics will try to do something along those lines. But yeah, I think it's just interesting to point that out.
Yeah, I would actually put myself in that category, though, as the last category that you just mentioned on the other end.
The blending of the two.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think both have to offer. And sometimes it's like, you'll see my presentation later, sometimes they can come to the same conclusions using different methods. But and the last one, which is one I like, the other one, some Judeo-Christian academics have went as far as claiming that Moses and Abraham never existed. Now, this is not accepted by conservative members of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic faiths, but they using that method. Some people went as far as saying that. So,
and I think, well, if I'm not mistaken, though, a big reason why that is the case is because they will generally assume or reject divine revelation, meaning they won't just accept the fact that something is divine revelation, and therefore, since this prophet says X, Y, and Z, that it must be true. That they will try to base it purely on strictly historical evidence. And if you go really, really far back to the days of Abraham, there's very limited historical evidence from that time period specifically. You have like hundreds of years later records of them, but they would argue that's so far ahead that you can't historically say with beyond a shadow of doubt that these people actually existed and did what they said they did. If I'm not mistaken, that's how they generally approach that topic.
No, I agree. And I've witnessed, Muslims and ex-Muslims debating over, whether Abraham ever went to Mecca and this and that. And I don't touch those topics at all. And I, say why. And I explained, I said, Abraham's an ahistorical figure. And I explained that by ahistorical, I'm not saying he didn't exist. I'm saying there's no evidence of his existence outside of religious scripture.
Yeah.
So now you're only arguing on a religious, like my story versus your story. And the one story does say very specifically he went. The one doesn't say he didn't, but doesn't say he did. And it's like, the people digging in and looking for things in the stories, but you're really just arguing two texts. There's no external evidence that could support or negate, either claim.
And both of which, if you would talk about the Quran and the Bible, both of which manuscript wise, I'm not saying, again, Old Testament people who would be really conservative would argue that, the Old Testament was written at the time of Abraham time of Moses, and is closer to the people that is more trustworthy from a historical standpoint. But the actual manuscripts, like physical manuscripts we have on hand, the earliest, as far as the Old Testament goes, I think is like 200 BC. So like, it's very, very difficult from a historical direct manuscript standpoint to make a historical case. Again, as you said, it'd be based on my story versus your story as far if you're looking at it from a historical lens.
Yes. But, yeah, it's like I don't get involved. I try to not get involved in theological, philosophical, like religious arguments. Like, me, I just like to, I like when I see something as either what I see as factually inaccurate or factually not disclosing all the information intentionally, and giving a one-sided. I'll discuss topics like those, but as far as topics that are purely just, my scripture versus your scripture with nothing else in between, or philosophy, a lot of these philosophical arguments that you look at, if you apply quantum physics, because they were built on Aristotelian metaphysics, which was built off Aristotelian physics, and we've had Newtonian, Einsteinian, and quantum physics since then. Aristotelian physical models are wrong. And so some of these arguments, like, they don't stand, like, there are quantum physical explanations that make more sense based upon the data than the philosophical ones. So, like, you really can end up poking so many holes in some of them that way, but then there will hit a point where, I mean, there are things that are unprovable, right?
I mean,
Unfalsifiable.
and the one thing with history too, though, is just because there isn't quote unquote like historical evidence that exists, most of what comes from the history is lost. Like, I mean, most things, 99% of things from history are lost. Like, it just, you won't be able to find them. So you can only piece together a vague idea of what happened on very limited evidence. But yeah.
Good point. That's a good point. This is something else that Muslims looked at in their study of comparative religion. The Torah is a compilation of multiple competing documents placed in one source. Whereas a lot of Muslims are referring to as Torah as the original text.
Would that be the 5 books of Moses, or are they referring to like the whole Old Testament?
I think more the 5 books of Moses.
Okay.
Now, what are now the 4 Gospels are Greek manuscripts written 40 to 160 years after Jesus, salam, by specific groups of Christians. We do not have one unified gospel in Aramaic or Hebrew, so that goes back to the other point I brought versus the texts that are with you versus the text. There are verses in the Quran which are apparent to either. And then we see that the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, who were local to Jesus, became considered heretical. So Muslims will look at that, and then find books like the Shepherd of Hermas, and there were other Christian texts that some of the early church fathers considered canonical, that were not considered canonical under Constantine. So, Muslims will look at all of these things in their comparative study to support the majority position over the minority during the classical period. I mean, up to the modern period. I just brought a lot of my examples. Some of my examples here are modern. So now the challenge is to the majority interpretation. So if you're looking for a verse with the wording, the gospel was altered. There's no verse with that wording, and that goes back to David Wood's challenge, which is there a verse? I said no. There's no single verse.
And if I remember correctly, that was the reason why he presented that challenge was because Zakir Naik often does this thing where he says, "Where does Jesus unequivocally say that I am God?" I think that's Zakir Naik's like famous line, so I think that's why David Wood presented that. Video.
And I didn't actually know that when I saw that for the first time. When I actually, I think I started posting on YouTube again like 3 years ago. And, I just would put in Islam or Muslim and, Quran, and some, video would pop up, and I'd watch that, but I'd watch that without any context. So, it's kind of why my first discussion on it, was a little, all over the place because, I didn't have the full context. And plus, when I don't have a presentation, I can get off on tangents. So it's kind of why I started. And then, like, I walked on an original tangent. I've answered a question in my head, but just because I didn't actually say it in real life.
and what's interesting, like, some people will try to be like, why don't you, if you're so confident in what you believe, why don't you debate people all the time and stuff? And it's like, not everyone's good at debating. Like, not everyone's quick on their feet and like really good at streamlined thinking in the moment. So I think I can relate to a certain extent with that, where I'm like, my mind can go all over the place during a discussion if I don't have an outline of what I'm doing.
Yeah. Earlier on, we went over the interpretation of the nephew of the Prophet Muhammad, Uthman, the third Khalifa. And I think I referenced Sa'id ibn Jubair, but I don't think I said him. That implies or infers that the previous scriptures were altered. Like, there's no direct statement, but there are implied statements. And I showed the narrative of Ibn Abbas and in the tafsir.
And I think also I would like to mention is that a big thing that plays into this discussion as well, as far as like you said that a big challenge often from the Muslim scholars and apologists and things is that there are multiple accounts of the gospel. There's multiple books in the Torah written by different authors, things like that. I think it's also important to note that how Christians view inspiration and how Muslims view inspiration is very different. Like the Quran is the literal words of Allah revealed over 23 years to Muhammad, versus Christians who believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, but may not be the literal, or are not necessarily the literal words of God, but rather the prophets, basically translation, or if you will, of the words. And thus it's a little bit the actual way that the actual idea of the divine revelation is different between the two.
Yeah, I agree. With the exception of a small minority that's considered heretical. Yeah, that has more of a Christian view. But
yeah,
overall,
a lot of Christians will say that the message is divine from God, but the actual words themselves aren't directly from God, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, but then obviously, yeah, and as you said, there are some in the Islamic community that hold that minority position, but is considered heretical by and large. Most Muslims agree that the Quran is the literal words of Allah.
So why would the Quran tell members of the Jewish and Christian faith to judge by their scriptures if they were altered? That question comes up a lot in chapter 5. So Muslims have understood these verses for over 1,200 years. They refer to law and not creed. So all 4 Sunni schools of law confirm this. So, and to this day, in majority Muslim countries, Jewish and Christian communities have separate laws that they judge by that are linked to their scriptures. So, like, for example, if you were to go to Kingdom of Jordan today, you'll have like national laws that apply to everyone.
Yeah.
But then you have civic and social laws that the Muslims go to a Muslim court and judge, by their scriptures, and the Christians go to a Christian court and judge by their scriptures. And so, this is still practiced today.
And that's based on, as you stated earlier, implied interpretation of what the verses mean. Yeah.
Yes. So now in the modern period, there's been intertextual interpretations. I myself have also engaged in this years ago, didn't know the term intertextual at the time. So recent studies in the Quran field we find by Muslims such as Imran al-Badwi and non-Muslims such as Fred Donner have been speaking about how the Quran is speaking to other texts at the time. Now, I also introduced this concept about a decade ago, but I didn't know, that there was an actual field in it and what the name of it was. So, for example, Badawi discussed that he has a book on, I think, the Quran and the Aramaic gospel tradition, where he pulls out passages of the Bible of the Aramaic gospel of Matthew that, he believes that the Quran is engaging in intertextuality with. Now, I focused more on the intertextuality with the sources that were available in Arabic and Syriac at the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So,
and this is in like the physical books you're talking about.
What do you
not
mean?
Oral. So, like, I mean, these would be all like the Infancy Gospel, the Arabic Infancy Gospels. These were all available in written form.
Oh, on this slide or the one before?
On this slide.
Yeah, so they may have been. So we do know that the written Arabic Gospels were physically in existence in the Hijaz region before the coming of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That being said, we don't know if they were physically available in Mecca and Medina.
Okay.
But they would have been physically available, somewhere in Arabia. Arabia, Yemen, Egypt, today, but those areas. The Quran, if you read the Quran is makes arguments, the questions and issues that were posed in the Hijaz region and claims to confirm and correct them. Now, this is something I didn't mention in my other previous talks on this, but Like when you read the text in English, there are certain things that are built in the grammar which you won't get or you won't understand. So I'm not going to use a Quran verse now, but I'll just use a sentence, an English phrase, right?
Mm-hmm.
The dog went to the park. Verily, the dog went to the park. Verily, the dog definitely went to the park, right? So the statement, the dog went to the park, is, in that grammar, would just be someone who's asking a question and just tends to trust you, right? So if you ask someone, what direction is the bathroom? That way, you believe the person is telling you the truth. You don't, right? When you're asking the question, you don't think you're asking a question, the guy's going to point you in the opposite direction. Then there is the then there is, if you put the phrase inna, like verily, verily the dog went to the park. Just by that inna being at the beginning, that the person, you don't even have to know the question. You know that someone asked a question. Like the question might not be posed, but someone asked that question, and the question, the person asking the question was someone who doubted you, right? Like they have a skeptical viewpoint. And then if you put the phrase in at the beginning and then the prefix li on the last word of the sentence, not only was the person asking the question, they were asking the question with a bad intention, right? So you got person one who asked it was they trust you. Person two asked it, but they're in doubt about you, but they're not like
hostile.
Yeah. And then that last person is asking you just to be not a nice guy.
Yeah.
But like you'll never know that just by reading the English text if you don't know those rules of language.
It reminds me to a certain extent of English translations of the Gospels or the Bible, where Jesus, for instance, will say, "Verily, verily, I say unto you," and then goes on to say a phrase, normally to the Pharisees or the Jewish people who were opposing him at the time.
I never made that connection. That makes perfect sense, though.
Yeah.
Getting back to this Quran answering like questions and dealing directly with an audience, like so the people are coming with these questions in that locality, and the Quran is addressing the issues and questions that's coming. So that's why certain things, like I think, are hard for modern readers or hard for like non-Muslim readers, because they're like this is all taking place in history. So we're actually reading dialogues that happened in a book. People are posing questions live and the answers coming live. And we have that recorded conversation, but we didn't live there. We weren't there. So there is something that, can be lost.
And this is also part of that, when it comes to discussion of Muhammad's prophethood, this also always comes up because people will go back to, like normally Christian apologists be like, well, a lot of things that Muhammad were addressing are found in these less reliable gospel accounts, whether they be Gnostic gospels or whether they be the Infancy gospels, because within the Quran and Hadith tradition, it talks about Jesus breathing life into clay birds, him speaking in the cradle, and things like that. All that can be found in gospel accounts that have later manuscript traditions than the four found in the current day canonical Bible. And then they will try to normally argue, well, he's arguing against a historically inaccurate gospel, and actually isn't addressing the true gospels. Generally, and then obviously the reverse argument is like, well, actually, then you can debate from there. But that is always this always comes up in that debate.
Yeah. So these 5 gospels, I wouldn't say are referenced in the Quran. And someone pointed out a mistake in my last one, which I'll address. The stories you just brought up, the infancy gospel of Thomas, the Arabic infancy gospel of Thomas, the proto-evangelium of James, those were all available in Arabic before the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So and when you read these gospels, the stories are very similar to many of the stories in the Quran, but the stories in the Christian versions are Trinitarian or dualistic, and
Yeah.
the stories in the Quran are Unitarian, monotheistic. So it's retelling the stories from a Unitarian perspective. And so, I I look at it more as the main idea is addressing the people and telling them what from the Quranic perspective, what their theological mistakes are. And so the main idea is, the Unitarian perspective, being a Unitarian in theology and worship. There's two different versions of the Apocalypse of Peter. In one of the versions, Jesus salam never dies on the cross, and so you find a reference to supporting this position, as well as we know of we can infer from the text, and also with some supporting historical documents, that there was a Jewish Christian debate, and this is even referenced by Paul in his epistles. But this Jewish Christian debate was still going on, at that time. Was the members of the Jewish faith were using the verses that any false prophet will die, and whoever is hanged on a tree is cursed by God. To say that's a sign that Jesus Christ والسلام, was not the Messiah. And I know Paul argued back that Christ became a curse for us.
Yeah.
Right. And that is the Christian argument. So the Muslim position seems to bring the middle ground in between the two arguments, that he doesn't die on the cross. It was just made to appear that way, but he's going to return, and then you must accept him as your Messiah when he returns, or else you're going to be standing with the false Messiah. So like the Quran, when you read it in this context, it's addressing our theological arguments and debates at the time.
And that's why it's always interesting when it comes down to that discussions, because if someone is a skeptic of Islam, they will often you can pull a lot of the same stories you find in the Quran from other sources, like the Bible, the infancy Gospels, the Torah, the Talmud. Even there's a couple that are parallel to a certain extent. I think Cain's blood one is a reference to the Talmud. Well, can be found in the Talmud, something similar. And you can find a lot of these similar stories from other sources in the Quran, but with a slight interpretation towards Tawhid.
Yes. And then the last one, someone had pointed out. So I said the Syriac Gospel of John. So I know that there were different versions at the time, and someone had pointed out that something that I had said on when I was on the David Wood show was a mistake. And they pointed out what the Peshitta text had said. But there was a Gospel of John in the Middle Eastern language at the time that's quoted throughout history in texts that uses the phrase Munahamana or Menahem, which I believe translates the glorious one. And then in the so Jesus announcing the coming of the glorious one. And then in the Quran, Jesus salam is announcing the coming of Ahmed, the praised one. So there was a text available using the intertextual approach that makes sense in this framework. but I might have quoted the wrong version in the last when I was speaking to David Wood and AP. So why discuss modern interpretations? So there are areas of Quran studies that were discovered later that earlier generations did not know. So, for example, the Quran has a ring composition structure. And this discovered over the last couple centuries, both by classically trained Muslim scholars in India and then Western academics such as Neil Robinson, Raymond Ferrin, Michael something, and I have his book somewhere, etc. So when people, a lot of times people felt in the past, the Quran seems to jump from topic and topic, and I can't, make out the order. The people actually showed the ring composition, showed how everything was interconnected and what the structure was like and what the style was like and who used it. Not, it was also used by ancient Greeks. It was used by other cultures. But when you actually read it through the ring composition, the structure starts to make a lot more sense than when you just pick it up and read it. But to the best of our knowledge, people, there's no evidence that people knew this in the first couple hundred years, but people know this now by later studies.
And it was interesting because when I read the Quran, and I read it in English. I don't obviously speak Arabic, but when I read it in English, it was really confusing at some points because it really does. You're like, what? Like, how did we go from a few verses about Mary to a verses about Moses to like? It's just like it would jump like a lot. And it was slightly confusing, and that's why like you had to like almost read commentaries and stuff to help you understand how these things fit.
So the miscellaneous challenges, this I discussed earlier. Some verses of the Quran discuss the Torah and the Gospel, the Jewish and Christians, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had in their possession, something that he was like engaging with. Others discuss the revelations of Jesus ﷺ and Moses ﷺ in their original languages. And I point out a lot of times in these debates, many of the Christians will focus on the first bullet point, and many of the Muslims will focus on the second bullet point. But very, rarely is there harmonization, which is part of the reason when I was discussing with David, I said, I don't think like a debate would be a good format because I'm not going to 100% disagree with you. I'm not going to 100% agree with you. I'm going to point out both perspectives and then say, or multiple perspectives and then say which, I support.
And this is one of those things that it does really take nuanced academic arguments and discussion to establish a case. Because the one, as a YouTuber, I know the one problem that a lot of people fall into is they like popular arguments that are 5 minutes or less, and they like to hear something that's like it supports their case. It's black and white. Everything's 100% clear. There's no question whatsoever. But in reality, most of these things aren't that way. You have to like actually spend time nuancing and understanding the different approaches.
Yeah, and like so I take an opposite approach of most Muslims when discussing and teaching Islam, and I think because it's needed in the modern day. I think the classical approach makes sense in the past under different circumstances. So in the classical approach, you basically, you'll learn the Quran, but not really learn what it means. You'll learn the rules and regulations, but not necessarily the methodologies of the school, that you're learning without knowing the methodologies and how they got there.
And there's a level of trust there and authority. I mean, especially early on when you're like, well, these people knew Muhammad, or these people knew people who knew Muhammad. And like, there's even in the earliest time period, there's this level of just trust and authority. Because if you're an illiterate common person who's working, day in and day out during the day, like you don't have time to go through academic rigor. You just aren't able to. So you have to take on with authority what you're being taught.
Yeah, and that makes sense. What I feel though is that Muslims are getting into arguments with like but there are methodologies, so there were methodologies in how to interpret the Quran
Hmm.
that they used to come to those conclusions.
Hmm.
But with that, whenever new information comes, you still plug it into the formula, but you might not come up to the same conclusion. So
Hmm.
I like to teach the formulas, right? And when it comes to hadith, what were the different ways that they graded the text and the chain? Um, because people just say this hadith is authentic. Someone graded it authentic using a methodology,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
What was the methodology?
Hmm.
And then with law, you know, which text takes precedence over others, how do you deal with conflicts? You know, four different, there are 4 to 5 different accepted schools right now within the Sunni
Hmm.
tradition, 2 within the Shia, and then the Ibadi tradition. And they come to the conclusion probably in 75 to 90% or more. But they use different methods.
Hmm.
So, like in classical Islam, you don't learn the methods until you're a scholar, basically, a
Hmm.
higher level scholar, or getting there, right?
Yeah.
And um, but I said that the non-Muslims don't have these rules. So if you,
Hmm.
as a Christian, want to learn the methods, you can learn it sincerely to understand. Oh, this is how they came to that, or you can learn it to support your own conclusion already, and then like throw it in Muslims' faces and say, "See, right?" Like I feel a lot of the Muslims who don't know the methodologies that they led to this
Yeah.
came from. They can't often intelligently address. When I say intelligent, I'm not saying people are stupid, but like they just don't have enough of the factual
Hmm.
information from history and from the textual history to engage in some of these discussions.
Hmm.
So what I have been trying to do is teach the methodologies first, and I've tried to simplify. Teach the methodologies first, because then you have the tools to get into
Hmm.
these arguments.
Hmm. And I mean,
I
even within any traditional religious group, there are methodologies. Like, I mean, as you point out earlier, there's methodologies within biblical understanding of how to interpret scripture and what methods to use. And I mean, even in early Christian tradition, within church tradition, there was methodologies to decipher what books are canonical and which books aren't. And this also leads to the Protestant Catholic divide to a certain extent. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, so like there's always methodologies in every religious group, and most people, as you said, aren't normally aware of them.
And it's like I think that if you're going to honestly discuss something, you have to be familiar with methodology, nuance, and differences of opinion.
And the underlying assumptions that differ between the different groups. Because a lot of times you go in with your preconceived assumption. So, like for instance, one off the bat that I can think of between Muslims and Christians is Christians don't assume prophets are perfect.
Yeah,
Muslims believe, by what I understand, most Muslims believe that prophets can't commit any major sins. Like that right off the bat is often something that comes up because I know I've seen in Christian discussions and even in my own personal life, I've seen discussions where it's like, you believe David committed adultery and murder. He's a prophet. He can't do that. And I'm like, well, we don't operate on the same assumptions.
yes, oh yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, and the other one sometimes, like no, I'll save that one for now. But one of the things I've also done on my site is I did a talk on the you know for like more for Muslims on the different methodologies that different Christian groups use um, to interpret the text, and
Hmm.
then how that leads to different conclusions.
Hmm.
And it was funny because some people from the Christian community were like, you don't know what you're talking about. This one is the only true one, and they took like one of like the 6 that I said, and it's the only true one. And I'm like, look, it's not my business to determine which is the true one and which is not the true one.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know, these all exist within the community that calls themselves Christian. Um,
Hmm.
you know, and like I was like, but Trinitarians are the only true Christians. Unitarians aren't. And I'm like, okay. But do you
It
make that?
the problem with interfaith dialogue is that you end up stumbling into intra-faith dialogue as well. It just ends up happening. So like whenever you make a video about like on my channel, I do a lot of videos about, you know, Hinduism, Islam, like as a general broad religion, you'll make a statement and people will be like, well, that's actually not true at all. But in reality, it's just what they're saying is my sector of this religion doesn't believe X, Y, and Z. Even
Yeah,
though it falls under the same camp.
you know.
But
And the funny part that I say, like though, like I always have to ask to see if the person is consistent. Is do you make that argument when you want to claim Isaac Newton? All right. If you don't claim Isaac Newton, then because what the argument is like, you know, each group, like, the atheists, Christians, Muslims, etc., each have groups amongst them that want to take credit for, all the scientific and modern scientific achievements.
yeah,
Right. Like,
yeah,
so
yeah,
the atheists will point out that, the majority of, the majority of scientists of today who are making, shaking and bacon in science and technology are atheists,
yeah.
and they're accurate. Then, people will claim that, well, this is, was all built on, you know, the Christians who did science. All these scientists, most of these scientists during this period were Christian. Well, and so they're the ones who are the catalysts, and they have a point too. But then the Muslims will come along and point at how many of you'll find in these European texts are quotes and translations from, Arabic texts from the golden era of Islam. So, the Christians built, really just built upon what, the Muslims in the golden era have done. And they have a point too. They're right too.
And then you'll
And
have
then,
people who will be like, well, the Greek philosophers and stuff. Like,
yeah, yes. And and then people will say, well, in the golden era of Islam, there were also Jewish and Christian scientists, and there were atheist scientists amongst the Muslims. Yes, but it was still, there was all four, and it was, probably Zoroastrians in there too, but it was still funded and under the banner of, the
and
Islamic
and I
government.
think it's hard for people to accept that scientific breakthroughs could be made independently in different parts of the world at different times. Like
Yes.
it is very possible for someone in Europe to discover something that someone in South America discovered and they never met.
Yeah.
So like when it comes down to those type of discussions, it's very hard to say we are the ones who started it and spread it across the entire world. Most likely that's not the case.
Yeah. And then, like, so the Muslims translated a lot of the works of the Greeks, the Persians, the
Mm-hmm.
and they got information from India and China. And, they built, there's like probably some other ancient Mesopotamians built science on it. But like when we look at really history, if we look at the only societies that really haven't technologically advanced are those that were in pure isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Like humans learn from each other regardless of what religion they are or what lack of religion they are,
Mm-hmm.
and they build on the knowledge from the previous.
And also,
So
generally speaking, what events are taking place will help predict what sort of breakthroughs are going to be made. So, like if you're in a time of warfare, most likely you're going to see a tactical inventions coming up. Like, I mean, like stuff like the crossbow and stuff were developed because Europe was in war, and so they needed a tactical weapon that was very effective, and the crossbow, comes into existence. Or if you're looking for like there's a plague and you're looking for medicine, I mean COVID-19, I guess you could say with the vaccine stuff, you have a bunch of people who are like, I'm going to put my brains together to find out how to come up with a solution to heal this thing. Like scientific breakthroughs and throughout history you can be predicted by what's going on in that time period as well. And then again, like the building off of each other's knowledge is how you get a lot of the best breakthroughs.
yeah, exactly. So my argument is everyone had their contribution, and with the exception of people who live in pure isolation, and people will continue to have contributions.
Mm-hmm.
And uh So then if Dubai or in the United Arab Emirates, begins to lead the scientific world next, are we going to say then that science is just, Islamic? I mean, it's different people contributing at different times.
Mm-hmm.
So, my conclusion is that there was disagreement during the formative period of Islam, a minority and a majority position.
Mm-hmm.
The majority went on inferred meanings of the text. The idea of the Christian scholars removing interpolations from the RSV, and the historical critical scholars of the Bible support that scriptures in our possession did not go back to Jesus or Moses, peace be upon them, lend more credibility to the majority view. The four schools, or that the majority view represents the Quranic view. The four schools of Islamic view understand judging by the previous scriptures to be legal and not creedal. This is still implemented today. New research in the intertextuality is expanding our understandings of the Quran. It's just basically a basic summary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good layout, and I think it's pretty fairly provided. It's a lot of stuff that like even when I listen to your discussion with David Wood and AP, who are well known for not being any fans of Islam, they didn't really disagree with most of the information presented and stuff. Like it's not really, it's just information. It's how you interpret that information, or what other evidences that may not have been presented that someone else is aware of. But at the end of the day, a lot of what's presented there is just information, and you do with it what you will.
Yeah. Do you have any other questions or?
I don't know if I have any other questions or comments beyond. Well, I guess the only thing I would say, in the thing that came to my mind about the RSV thing, because I mean, obviously, a lot of Muslims will, when it comes to the various English translations of the Bible and various translations of the Bible. I think sometimes it's important to note that most Christian scholars acknowledge that 99% of what's considered to be the differences between the different manuscripts and stuff is mostly grammatical and mostly about the literature, and has very little impact on theological implications. So like the difference between the KJV and, I don't know, I'm just trying to think, ESV, other translations of the Bible, the theological differences are very, very minimal. It's mostly either stories, like small stories, like the one I forget which one you mentioned. Man, I can't remember. But it's either normally stories like that, or like a couple verses that overarchingly don't have a huge impact on the theology of what I would call conservative Christianity. Obviously, you have wide spectrum there. But yeah.
Okay.
But other than that,
Yeah.
I don't know if I really have any other thoughts on the matter.
No, I hear you.
But yeah. So thank you for coming on here and presenting that. I think that's insightful, and I think it's helpful for people to kind of see that history and kind of see how Muslims view the Bible and how they come to those implied interpretations or inferred interpretations. And I think this helps further the discussion to have better, more helpful, educated discussions between interfaith groups, because normally discussions are unfruitful if you don't actually operate on understanding each other. So I am thankful for you coming on. Do you have any final words or stuff before I close out here?
No, if you're interested in what I have to say, or want to listen to more, you can subscribe to my channel, Experience Islam with the Faroos, or just put THE space FAROOS into your search in YouTube, and you'll see my face.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. And as always, before I close out, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And go out there and light the world yourselves.